Hey guys! Tonight we're going to travel back in time and to a world of towering stone castles, flickering torchlight and long winter nights. But before we begin, I have a quick question for you. A surprising number of people who watch these videos every night aren't actually subscribed to the channel yet. If you enjoy relaxing history stories like this one, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me know you'd like more calm journeys into the past. And while you're down there, tell me something interesting in the comments. What city are you watching this video from tonight? I always enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from, especially as these quiet stories travel across the world. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and let's slowly drift back to a freezing winter night, deep in the Middle Ages. Picture a massive stone castle standing alone on a snowy hill. The wind is cold, the sky is dark. Snow quietly falls across the courtyard below. From the outside, the castle looks strong, powerful, almost timeless. But inside those walls, winter felt very different, because despite their size and strength, medieval castles were often unbelievably cold. In fact, for many people living inside them, winter could feel just as harsh indoors as it did outside. To understand why, we need to imagine life in one of these castles on a typical winter evening. The sun has already set. The courtyard below the castle walls is silent, covered in a thin blanket of snow. A few guards walk slowly along the stone walls, their boots crunching against the frost as they patrol. Inside the castle gates, a narrow stone passage leads into the inner courtyard. Torches flicker along the walls, their orange glow dancing against the cold grey stone. Servants hurry through the corridors carrying bundles of firewood. Winter evenings meant one thing inside a castle: keeping the fires alive, because without fire, the cold would quickly take over every room. The walls of a castle were enormous, some were several meters thick. They were built from heavy stone designed to stop enemies and protect the people inside. But those same walls also held onto the cold. Stone absorbs temperature slowly, but once it becomes cold, it stays cold for a very long time. During winter, that meant the castle walls themselves felt like blocks of ice. If you touched them with your bare hand, the chill would move straight through your skin. Even rooms with burning fireplaces often felt cold and drafty. Warm air from the fire would rise toward the high ceilings, leaving the lower parts of the room only slightly warmer than the winter air outside. In large halls, the warmth from a single fire could disappear quickly, and castles were full of large halls. One of the most important rooms in any castle was the Great Hall. This was the main gathering space where meals were eaten, visitors were welcomed, and important meetings took place. During winter evenings, the Great Hall became the warmest and most lively place in the entire castle. A huge fireplace burned along one wall. The flames cracked and popped as thick logs slowly turned into glowing coals. Servants added more wood throughout the evening, making sure the fire never grew too small. Still, even such a large fire struggled against the cold stone walls. Imagine sitting at one of the long wooden tables inside the Great Hall. You can feel warmth on one side of your body from the fire, but the air behind you still feels cold. Your breath might even appear faintly in the air. People inside castles often wore heavy clothing even indoors. Wool tunics, cloaks, and fur-lined garments were common during winter months. Even nobles, who lived in the most comfortable rooms of the castle, rarely walked around in light clothing. Warmth had to be kept close to the body, because once the cold settled into the castle, it was difficult to remove. The floors were also made from stone, and stone floors in winter were freezing. Servants sometimes spread rushes or straw across the floor to provide a little insulation. This also made walking more comfortable, especially for people wearing thin leather shoes. In wealthier castles, colourful tapestries hung along the walls. At first glance, these tapestries looked like decorations. They showed scenes of hunting, battles, forests, or religious stories. But they had another important purpose. They helped keep rooms warmer. The thick woven fabric acted like a barrier between the cold stone wall and the warmer air inside the room. Without tapestries, the walls would release cold into the room much faster. So while they were beautiful, they were also practical. In private chambers, where the lord and lady of the castle lived, fireplaces burned almost constantly during winter. Servants carefully tended these fires. If the flames died during the night, the room could quickly become freezing before morning. Even with the fire burning, sleeping inside a castle required clever solutions to stay warm. Large wooden beds often had tall frames with curtains surrounding them. These curtains were made from heavy fabric. When closed, they trapped warm air around the bed. It created a small pocket of warmth inside the larger cold room. In a way, the bed became its own tiny heated space. Blankets made from wool or fur added even more warmth. But despite all these efforts, winter nights inside a medieval castle were rarely truly comfortable. Cold drafts often slipped through small cracks around doors and windows. Many castle windows were narrow and covered with wooden shutters instead of glass. Even when closed tightly, small gaps allowed cold air to creep inside. The wind outside could sometimes be heard whispering through the corridors, and the long stone hallways of a castle made that wind sound even colder. Late at night, when most people had gone to bed, the castle grew quiet. Only a few torches burned along the walls. A guard walked slowly through the courtyard below, and in the highest towers, snow continued to fall silently against the stone. Inside their beds, people wrapped themselves tightly in blankets and cloaks. The fires slowly burned lower, and the castle settled into a cold, peaceful sleep. But morning would arrive soon enough, and with it, another freezing day inside the stone walls. Yet this was only the beginning of the story, because living in a medieval castle during winter meant dealing with many other challenges, from icy corridors and frozen water buckets, to servants racing through the snow to keep the fires alive. And as we continue exploring this quiet winter world, we'll slowly discover just how people manage to live, work, and sleep inside these enormous stone buildings during the coldest months of the year. So relax a little deeper, listen to the soft crackle of the fire, and imagine the quiet castle resting beneath falling snow. The fire in the great hall had burned low by the time midnight arrived. A few glowing embers still flickered softly beneath the thick iron grate. Outside the tall wooden doors of the hall, the castle had fallen into a deep and quiet stillness. Snow continued to fall gently over the towers and walls, slowly covering the stone courtyard below. The guards on the walls pulled their cloaks tighter around their shoulders as the cold wind moved across the battlements. Inside the castle, most of the residents had already retreated to their sleeping chambers, but winter nights inside a medieval castle were never completely silent. Somewhere down a long stone corridor, a servant walked carefully while carrying a lantern. The small flame inside the glass shook slightly as cold air moved through the hallway. Even deep inside the castle, winter could find its way through the smallest cracks. The servant moved quietly past several closed wooden doors. Behind those doors, nobles, guests, and members of the household were sleeping beneath heavy blankets. But comfort inside a castle was often an illusion. Even the most luxurious chambers could feel surprisingly cold during winter months. Stone has a strange relationship with warmth. It absorbs cold slowly, and once it becomes cold, it releases that chill for hours and sometimes even days. During winter, the thick castle walls would slowly gather the cold from the outside air. That cold then spread inward through the stone like a quiet, invisible tide. By nightfall, the entire building seemed to breathe out a gentle chill. This meant that even rooms with large fireplaces often struggled to stay warm. The fire might warm the air close to the flames, but the cold stone walls surrounding the room continued to pull heat away. Servants understood this better than anyone. Throughout the castle, their nightly duties often involved keeping the fires alive. In one part of the castle, 2 young servants carried baskets filled with chopped wood. The wood had been gathered weeks earlier and stored carefully in dry sheds inside the castle grounds. Winter preparation was extremely important for castle life. Without enough firewood, even a powerful fortress could become an uncomfortable place to live. The servants quietly entered a chamber where a small fire had almost faded into ash. The room belonged to one of the visiting knights staying at the castle during the winter season. Travel during winter was difficult, and many travellers stayed for long periods once they reached a safe stronghold. One servant knelt beside the fireplace and carefully added 2 fresh logs. Another used a metal poker to stir the glowing embers beneath them. Within moments, a faint orange glow returned to life. Soon, small flames began licking the edges of the wood. The room slowly grew a little warmer. Across the castle, in a different tower, a noblewoman slept inside a bed surrounded by thick curtains. The curtains were made of heavy fabric designed to trap warmth. Inside this small enclosed space, the air was noticeably warmer than the rest of the room. Medieval beds in castles were not just pieces of furniture. They were carefully designed sleeping shelters. The wooden frames often supported thick curtains on all sides. When closed, the curtains helped keep warm air from escaping too quickly. Fur blankets and wool covers were layered carefully across the bed. Some beds even had feather mattresses, which were considered a great luxury at the time. Feathers trapped warm air extremely well, making them one of the best materials available for sleeping comfort. Still, even with these advantages, castle residents often slept wearing layers of clothing. Wool tunics, stockings, and sometimes even cloaks remained on through the night. Cold air could slip through gaps in windows or beneath doors, and nobody wanted to wake up shivering in the dark. Meanwhile, in the castle kitchens, a faint glow still came from the large cooking hearth. The kitchen was one of the warmest places in the entire castle. Massive fires burned there during the day to prepare meals for everyone living inside the walls. Even late at night, the heat stored in the stone ovens and hearths continued to warm the room. A tired kitchen worker rested on a wooden bench beside the dying fire. The warmth from the stones felt comforting after a long day of work. The smell of baked bread and roasted meat still lingered in the air. Outside the kitchen windows, frost had formed along the wooden frames. The glass panes were thin and imperfect by modern standards. Small crystals of ice slowly spread across them during the coldest hours of the night. Beyond those windows, the snow-covered courtyard rested in peaceful silence. But winter life in a castle did not stop entirely when people went to sleep. Certain duties continued through the dark hours. Guards walked along the walls to watch for danger. Stable workers checked on the horses resting inside the stables. And servants made quiet rounds through the halls to make sure fires stayed alive. These nightly routines were essential. Without them, the cold would slowly take control of the castle before morning arrived. Back in the great hall, the final embers of the evening fire gave off a faint reddish glow. Long wooden tables stood empty now. Earlier that evening they had been filled with people eating warm food and sharing stories. Stews, bread, roasted meats, and warm drinks helped everyone stay comfortable during winter nights. Food played a surprisingly important role in staying warm. Meals rich in grains, meat, and fats gave the body energy needed to fight the cold. Hot drinks like spiced wine or warm ale were also common during winter evenings. They helped people relax and brought temporary warmth after a long day in cold weather. As the night slowly moved toward morning, the temperature outside dropped even further. The snow on the castle roof sparkled faintly under the pale moonlight. Inside the walls, the castle seemed almost asleep. But in one quiet chamber, a young servant named Thomas remained awake. His job was to check the fireplaces along a section of the castle corridor before dawn arrived. He carried a lantern in one hand and a small bundle of firewood in the other. Thomas had grown used to the cold during his years of service. Still, winter nights like this one always reminded him just how enormous and empty the castle could feel after midnight. His footsteps echoed softly along the stone floor as he walked. The corridor stretched far into the distance, lit only by occasional torches along the walls. He stopped at a small guest chamber where the fire had grown weak. Carefully opening the fireplace grate, he added another piece of wood and stirred the coals. The flames returned quickly, filling the room with gentle light. Thomas allowed himself a brief moment beside the warmth before continuing his rounds. This simple routine repeated many times each night throughout the castle. Without servants like Thomas, winter inside these great stone buildings would have been far more difficult to endure. Slowly the dark hours passed. The moon moved lower across the sky above the castle towers. The wind grew quieter, and the snow stopped falling for a while. Inside their curtained beds, the castle residents slept beneath layers of wool and fur. And although the cold stone walls still held the chill of winter, the small fires scattered throughout the castle continued their quiet battle against the freezing night. Morning would arrive soon. Servants would wake early to rekindle fires, prepare breakfast, and open the heavy shutters to let in pale winter sunlight. But for now, the castle remained wrapped in silence, a vast stone fortress resting beneath a blanket of snow, and deep within its walls, hundreds of small stories continued quietly through the long, medieval winter night. Somewhere beyond the thick stone walls of the castle, the first quiet signs of morning were beginning to appear. The sky was still dark, but the deep black of night had slowly softened into a faint grey. Winter mornings often arrived slowly, especially during the coldest months of the year. Inside the castle, the air felt even colder just before sunrise. The small fires that had been carefully maintained through the night were now burning low again. Ash covered the glowing embers, hiding most of their warmth beneath a thin grey layer. Servants were the first people to wake in the castle. Long before the nobles or guests stirred in their beds, the daily work of warming the castle had to begin again. In a narrow servants' chamber near the kitchens, several workers slowly climbed out from beneath thick wool blankets. The room was simple and small. Rows of wooden sleeping pallets lined the walls. There were no curtains around these beds, and no large fireplaces either. The servants relied mostly on shared body warmth and heavy blankets to survive the cold nights. One young servant pulled his boots on quickly and rubbed his hands together. His breath formed small white clouds in the cold air of the room. Winter mornings always started like this. Cold floors, cold walls, and cold hands. But the moment work began, warmth slowly returned. Within minutes, the servants were moving through the corridors, carrying baskets of firewood and bundles of kindling. The castle slowly began to wake. In the kitchens, the large hearth fire was the first to be revived. This fire was one of the most important in the entire castle. It would burn almost constantly throughout the day, heating the room where food for dozens or sometimes hundreds of people would be prepared. A cook carefully pushed aside the ashes from the previous night's fire. Beneath them, small glowing embers still survived. This was exactly what the kitchen staff had hoped for. Starting a fire from cold stone was difficult, but waking an old fire back to life was much easier. Dry kindling was placed gently over the embers, then thin sticks were stacked carefully above it. Soon a small flame appeared, flickering quietly in the early morning darkness. Within minutes the fire began to grow stronger. The warm glow slowly spread across the kitchen walls. Large iron pots hung above the hearth, waiting to be filled with water for morning porridge. Breakfast in a medieval castle was usually simple but filling. Bread, porridge made from oats or barley, and sometimes cheese or leftover meat from the previous night's meal. Hot food was especially important during winter mornings. After a freezing night, warm meals helped restore energy and body heat. Meanwhile, in other parts of the castle, servants moved through the sleeping chambers of nobles and guests. They worked quietly so as not to disturb anyone too early. Their job was to open shutters, stir fireplaces, and prepare rooms for the day. One servant carefully opened the wooden shutters of a tower chamber. A pale blue winter light spilled into the room. Outside, the castle courtyard looked completely transformed by the night's snowfall. The ground was covered in a smooth blanket of white. Footprints from the previous evening had disappeared beneath the fresh snow. Thin smoke rose gently from several chimneys above the castle roof. The fires inside were slowly coming back to life. In the stables, the stable workers had already begun their morning routine. Horses stamped their hooves softly against the frozen ground. Their warm breath filled the stable air with mist. Compared to the rest of the castle, the stables were surprisingly comfortable during winter. The animals themselves produced a great deal of warmth. Their body heat helped keep the building from becoming too cold overnight. Straw bedding also helped trap warmth close to the ground. Stable workers often said the horses slept better than many castle servants during the coldest nights. Back inside the main castle tower, the great hall slowly began to warm again. Servants carried fresh logs toward the massive central fireplace. This hearth was large enough for a person to stand inside. When fully burning, the fire could light almost the entire hall with a golden glow. One servant used a long iron tool to stir the ashes. Another carefully stacked thick logs over the glowing embers. Soon a deep crackling sound filled the quiet hall. Flames rose slowly between the logs. The firelight danced across the tall stone walls and wooden beams above. The great hall would soon become the busiest room in the castle. By mid-morning it would be filled with voices, footsteps, and the sounds of daily activity. But for now it remained mostly quiet. Only a few servants moved between the long wooden tables preparing for the day ahead. Heavy benches were straightened. Floor rushes were replaced with fresh dry straw. These rushes helped insulate the cold stone floor slightly and made walking more comfortable. During winter, replacing damp rushes was especially important. Moisture trapped in the old ones could make the entire hall feel colder. High above, the castle towers stood against the pale winter sky. Guards who had spent the night on watch were finishing their shifts. Their cloaks were dusted lightly with snow. Night watch during winter was one of the hardest duties in castle life. Standing for hours in freezing wind required strength and patience. The stone beneath their boots often felt like solid ice. Still, these guards played a critical role in protecting the castle. Even during peaceful times, someone always had to watch the horizon. As the sky brightened further, the castle slowly filled with new sounds. Doors creaked open. Footsteps echoed through the corridors. Distant voices began to rise from different parts of the building. The long medieval winter night was finally ending. In a guest chamber near the eastern tower, a knight stirred beneath a pile of fur blankets. The faint warmth from his fireplace had kept the worst of the cold away, but the room still carried the chill of the stone walls. He reached for his wool cloak before even stepping out of bed. This was a common habit among castle residents. Warm clothing was the first defence against the cold. Fireplaces helped, but clothing remained far more reliable throughout the day. Soon the castle corridors began filling with people preparing for their daily tasks. Servants hurried toward the kitchens. Messengers carried letters between chambers. Workers moved tools and supplies across the courtyard. Winter life inside a castle required constant effort from everyone living there. Heating fires, preparing food, caring for animals, repairing equipment, and maintaining the building itself. Each task helped the entire castle survive the harsh season. Outside the walls, the surrounding countryside lay frozen and quiet beneath the snow. But inside the fortress, life continued steadily. Stone walls might have kept enemies away, but surviving winter inside them required teamwork, patience, and a great deal of firewood. And as the first true sunlight of the day touched the highest towers of the castle, the long cold night quietly faded into another busy winter morning. By the time the pale winter sun climbed a little higher above the horizon, the castle had fully awakened. Light slowly entered the narrow windows and arrow slits carved into the thick stone walls. These windows were never very large. In medieval castles, windows were designed more for defence than comfort. Large openings in the walls could weaken the structure and allow enemies to shoot arrows inside. So most castle windows remained narrow and small, which unfortunately meant that very little sunlight entered the rooms during winter. Even on bright days, the interior corridors of a castle often remained dim and cool. Servants carried candles and lanterns through many of these darker hallways, especially during the colder months when daylight hours were short. In the great hall, the morning fire now burned strongly. Thick logs cracked loudly as they settled deeper into the flames. The warmth from the hearth slowly spread across the large room, though it never reached every corner. Castle halls were enormous spaces. High ceilings allowed smoke from the fire to rise upward and escape through vents or chimneys. But that same height also made it difficult to keep heat close to the ground, where people actually sat and worked. Anyone standing near the fireplace felt comfortable, but someone sitting at the far end of the hall might still feel the cold air brushing across their boots. Breakfast was now being served along the long wooden tables. Large wooden bowls filled with steaming porridge were placed in front of the castle residents. The warm smell of oats filled the air. Fresh bread, baked earlier that morning, was passed from hand to hand. Thick slices were sometimes dipped directly into the porridge or eaten with butter and cheese. Warm meals like this were not only filling but necessary during winter. People living in castles needed a great deal of energy to stay warm and complete their daily work. Heavy wool clothing also played a large role in surviving the cold. Most people wore several layers throughout the day. A linen shirt rested closest to the skin. Over that came wool tunics, thick cloaks, and sometimes fur-lined garments for extra protection. Wool was one of the most valuable materials in medieval life. It trapped warm air extremely well and remained effective even when slightly damp. Many castle residents owned several wool garments specifically designed for winter. Even nobles dressed warmly indoors despite their higher status. Stone walls did not care about rank or title. Cold air touched everyone equally inside a castle. In one corner of the great hall, a group of servants worked to hang thick tapestries along the walls. These large woven fabrics served several important purposes. They decorated the hall with colourful scenes of battles, hunting, and noble family histories. But more importantly, during winter, tapestries helped block the cold coming from the stone walls. The heavy cloth created a thin barrier that trapped warmer air inside the room. Without tapestries, the walls would release cold directly into the hall. Many castles invested heavily in these wall hangings for exactly this reason. In fact, wealthy nobles sometimes travelled with their tapestries when moving between castles. They were valuable, beautiful, and practical all at the same time. Meanwhile, in the kitchens, the day's real work had only just begun. Several cooks stood around the massive hearth preparing food for the rest of the day. Large iron pots filled with water hung above the fire. Vegetables were chopped and dropped into the steaming liquid to begin the slow process of making stew. Stews were one of the most common meals during medieval winters. They allowed cooks to combine grains, vegetables, and small amounts of meat into filling dishes that could feed many people at once. The kitchen itself felt pleasantly warm compared to the rest of the castle. The constant fire heated the stone floors and walls throughout the day. Workers often preferred kitchen duty during winter, simply because it offered relief from the cold corridors elsewhere in the castle. Not far from the kitchens, the castle bakery was also active. Bread ovens built from thick stone held heat for long periods after the fire was removed. Bakers used long wooden paddles to slide loaves deep into the oven chambers. Within minutes, the smell of baking bread filled the air again. Fresh bread was one of the most comforting foods during winter months. It was simple, warm, and satisfying. Outside in the castle courtyard, the cold winter air still ruled the open space. Servants crossing the yard pulled their cloaks tightly around themselves as they hurried between buildings. Snow crunched loudly beneath their boots. A few workers shoveled pathways to make movement easier across the courtyard. Snow might look beautiful covering the castle walls, but too much of it could quickly become a problem. Heavy snowfall sometimes blocked gates, or made it difficult for carts to enter the fortress. Maintaining clear paths was an important daily task. Nearby, the blacksmith's workshop glowed faintly from its forge fire. The smith worked steadily, hammering heated iron on an anvil. The ringing sound echoed across the courtyard walls. Like the kitchen, the blacksmith's forge created a warm working environment during winter. The heat from the furnace pushed back the cold air that tried to slip inside. Sparks rose briefly into the air with each strike of the hammer. Inside the castle towers, daily life continued at a slower pace. Nobles often spent winter mornings reading, writing letters, or discussing plans with advisors. Some practiced sword training in covered courtyards or training halls to keep their skills sharp even during the colder months. But long winter seasons also encouraged quieter activities. Storytelling, music, and games were common forms of entertainment when outdoor travel became difficult. Minstrels sometimes performed in the great hall during long winter evenings. Their songs echoed beneath the tall wooden roof beams while the fire crackled nearby. These small moments of warmth and laughter helped people forget the cold waiting beyond the castle walls. Despite all these efforts, winter remained a constant presence inside the castle. Cold draughts slipped through cracks in doors, stone floors never truly lost their chill, and even the warmest fires eventually faded if they were not carefully maintained. Yet castles were designed for survival. They were built to endure harsh weather just as much as they were built to resist enemy attacks. Thick walls protected the people inside from strong winds and heavy storms. Food stores collected during autumn helped sustain the castle through the long winter months. Firewood gathered from nearby forests became one of the most valuable resources of the season. Without it, castle life would quickly grow unbearable. As the winter sun continued its slow journey across the sky, light spread across the snowy countryside surrounding the fortress. Inside the walls, people continued their work, meals, and conversations. Each fire burning in a hearth or oven pushed back the cold just a little longer, and although the stone walls still held the chill of the season, the castle remained alive with activity, warmth, and the steady rhythm of medieval winter life. As the winter day slowly moved toward midday, the castle settled into the steady rhythm of daily life. The early morning chill had softened slightly in rooms where fires had been burning for several hours. But the warmth never lasted long without constant attention. Servants continued moving through the halls, carrying wood, tending fireplaces, and making sure each room stayed as comfortable as possible. Even with all this effort, the castle still felt cold in many places. Long stone corridors acted almost like tunnels for the winter air. Draughts slipped beneath doors and through cracks in the old wooden frames. When someone walked down these passageways, they could often feel the sudden change in temperature as they passed from a warm room into a colder hallway. In the great hall, the large hearth fire had grown strong enough to warm the space around it. Several members of the castle household had gathered there after breakfast. Some sat on benches near the flames, enjoying the heat while talking quietly. Others worked nearby, mending clothing or sharpening small tools used for daily tasks. The great hall was more than just a dining area. It served as the main centre of life inside the castle. Meetings were held there. Guests were welcomed there. Stories were told there during long evenings when darkness arrived early in winter. Because of its size and its large central fireplace, it was also one of the warmer places inside the fortress during the day. Still, the warmth from the fire did not spread evenly. People sitting closest to the hearth sometimes grew almost too warm. Meanwhile, those sitting farther away often kept their cloaks wrapped tightly around their shoulders. This uneven warmth was simply part of castle life. In one corner of the hall, a group of servants carefully laid fresh rushes across part of the stone floor. These rushes were made from dried plants and grasses gathered during warmer months. They helped cover the cold stone and added a thin layer of insulation underfoot. Over time, the rushes became dirty and damp from daily use, so they had to be replaced regularly. During winter, replacing them was especially important. Wet rushes could make the floor feel even colder than bare stone. Near the high table at the far end of the hall, a nobleman sat reading a parchment letter. A small brazier filled with glowing charcoal rested nearby. Brazier fires were much smaller than the great hearths, but they could provide gentle warmth for private corners of a room. These portable heat sources were sometimes moved around the castle, depending on where warmth was needed most. In the castle kitchens, the steady work of cooking continued throughout the day. Large pots of stew bubbled slowly above the fire. The thick mixture of grains, vegetables, and meat filled the room with a rich smell that drifted into nearby corridors. The kitchen remained one of the few places in the castle where winter almost seemed to disappear for a while. The constant heat from the hearth warmed the stone walls and floors. Steam rose into the air as water boiled in heavy iron pots. Cooks moved quickly from one task to another, their faces glowing slightly from the firelight. They chopped carrots, onions and cabbage gathered from the castle's winter food stores. Barrels of salted meat were opened carefully to add small portions to the stew. Preserving meat with salt had been one of the most important preparations before winter began. Without preservation, food would spoil quickly during the long cold season. Nearby, the bakery oven still held warmth from the morning's bread baking. Some of that heat would remain trapped inside the thick stone for hours. Bakers often used this leftover warmth to prepare smaller pastries or additional loaves later in the day. Outside the castle walls, the countryside remained quiet beneath the winter snow. Most farmers in the nearby villages had already completed their autumn harvest weeks earlier. Fields now rested empty and frozen, waiting for spring to return. During these months, many villagers focused on repairing tools, caring for animals, and using the food they had carefully stored before winter arrived. Back inside the castle courtyard, a few workers chipped away small patches of ice that had formed along the stone pathways. Sunlight touched the highest towers of the fortress, but barely reached the lower courtyard floor. The tall walls cast long shadows across the snow. A messenger arrived at the main gate carrying news from a nearby town. His horse's breath rose in thick clouds as it stood waiting near the entrance. Travel during winter was slow and difficult. Roads became muddy, icy, or completely covered in snow. Messengers often had to stop at castles or villages along their route, simply to rest and warm themselves beside a fire. Inside the castle towers, daily routines continued quietly. Some nobles spent time reviewing documents or discussing matters of land and trade with advisors. Others walked through the halls speaking with members of the household or planning events for the coming weeks. Winter was often a time for preparation rather than action. Military campaigns were rarely launched during the coldest months. Armies needed food, horses, and good weather to travel effectively. Instead, winter allowed time for repairs, planning, and strengthening alliances through visits and gatherings. In one tower chamber, a young noblewoman sat beside a window sewing a piece of embroidery. A small fire burned in the nearby hearth. Even so, she kept a thick fur-lined cloak wrapped around her shoulders as she worked. The light from the window was helpful for sewing, but the stone walls surrounding the room still carried a lingering chill. From her seat she could see the frozen countryside stretching far beyond the castle walls. Thin smoke rose from distant cottages where villagers warmed themselves around their own fires. Though their homes were smaller than the castle, they often stayed warmer because of their size. Small rooms were easier to heat than the vast chambers inside a fortress. This was one of the strange realities of medieval castles. They looked strong and impressive from the outside, but inside they could sometimes feel surprisingly uncomfortable during winter. Still, the castle provided safety, shelter, and community. Hundreds of people worked together within its walls to keep daily life running smoothly despite the cold. Servants maintained fires, cooks prepared warm meals, guards protected the walls, craftsmen repaired tools and equipment. Each person played a role in helping the entire household endure the long season. As the afternoon slowly approached, the winter sun climbed a little higher, but offered very little warmth. Its pale light reflected off the snowy landscape outside the castle. Inside, the fires continued their quiet battle against the cold stone walls. Logs crackled in hearths, steam rose from kitchen pots, voices echoed gently through the corridors. And although winter still surrounded the castle on every side, life inside its walls carried on steadily, one warm fire at a time. As the pale winter afternoon slowly continued, the castle settled into a quieter rhythm. The busy rush of the morning had passed, and many daily tasks were now moving at a slower, steadier pace. Outside, the sun hung low in the cold sky, casting long, pale light across the snowy fields beyond the castle walls. Inside the fortress, that sunlight slipped through narrow windows and stretched across the stone floors in thin golden lines. But even where sunlight touched the ground, the stone remained cold. Castle floors absorbed warmth very slowly. Sometimes they never truly warmed at all during the winter months. Because of this, many rooms used thick rugs or layers of rushes to cover the ground. These coverings helped make the floors slightly more comfortable to walk on. Without them, bare stone could quickly chill anyone standing for long periods. In the great hall, the fire continued burning steadily. Servants had already added several fresh logs to keep the flames strong. The smell of smoke and warm wood drifted gently through the large chamber. A few members of the household still sat near the hearth, enjoying the warmth while passing the quiet afternoon hours. Some were repairing clothing that had been worn thin from daily use. Needles moved slowly through thick wool fabric as hands worked carefully by the firelight. Winter was often the best time for mending clothes. Outdoor work was limited, and people spent more time indoors where these small tasks could finally be completed. Nearby, a young page practiced reading aloud from a worn parchment scroll. His voice echoed softly in the high-ceilinged hall. Learning to read and write was an important skill for many young nobles training for future responsibilities. Even on cold winter days, education continued inside the castle walls. At the far end of the hall, a pair of guards warmed themselves briefly near the hearth after finishing a patrol along the outer walls. Their cloaks carried small traces of snow that had not yet melted. Standing watch outside during winter remained one of the most difficult duties. The wind often swept strongly across the castle towers. Even thick wool cloaks could not fully block the biting air at those heights. Still, the guards understood the importance of their task. The castle might seem peaceful now, but vigilance was always necessary. After a few moments by the fire, the guards returned to their posts. Beyond the walls, the frozen countryside remained silent and still. In the kitchens, preparations had already begun for the evening meal. Cooking in a medieval castle often required many hours of work. Large meals had to be planned carefully so that food would be ready at the right time. Cooks stirred great pots of stew, while others prepared roasted meats and fresh bread. The warmth from the kitchen hearth had filled the room with comfortable heat. Workers there had rolled up their sleeves slightly as they moved quickly between the ovens and preparation tables. Steam rose from boiling water. The steady sound of chopping vegetables echoed across the stone walls. This constant activity made the kitchen one of the liveliest rooms in the castle during winter afternoons. Just outside the kitchen door, a servant stacked several bundles of firewood against the wall. Keeping enough wood inside the castle was always a major concern during winter. Every fireplace, oven and forge depended on a steady supply of fuel. Woodcutters working in nearby forests had gathered large quantities before winter arrived. But even with careful planning, the castle used enormous amounts of firewood each day. Servants carefully managed the supply to make sure it lasted through the long cold months. In another part of the castle, the chapel remained quiet and peaceful. A few candles burned gently near the stone altar. The small flames flickered softly in the still air. Some members of the household stopped there during the afternoon to pray or sit quietly for a few moments. The chapel had its own simple fireplace, though it was rarely as warm as other rooms. Even so, its calm atmosphere made it a comforting place during the long winter season. Higher up in one of the castle towers, a group of craftsmen worked on repairing damaged armour and weapons. The room smelled faintly of oil and metal. Small braziers burned nearby to provide both light and a little warmth. Armour pieces rested on wooden stands while craftsmen carefully hammered out dents or replaced worn leather straps. Winter months often became a time for maintenance. Equipment that had seen heavy use during the year could finally be repaired before the next season of travel or battle. From the narrow tower windows, the craftsmen could see the snow-covered forest stretching across the horizon. Occasionally a distant bird crossed the pale sky before disappearing beyond the hills. Back in the castle courtyard, the afternoon light was already beginning to fade slightly. Winter days were short. Darkness would arrive sooner than many people wished. A few stable workers brushed the coats of the horses and added fresh straw to their stalls. The animals seemed calm and comfortable in the warmth created by their shared body heat. Compared to the open courtyard, the stables felt almost cosy. The scent of hay and wood mixed gently in the air. One stable boy carried a lantern as he checked each stall carefully. Horses were valuable animals, and caring for them properly during winter was extremely important. If a horse became sick or weak during the cold months, it could cause serious problems later when travel resumed. Inside the castle towers, servants began lighting additional candles along the corridors. The fading daylight made the stone hallways darker with every passing minute. Small pools of golden light appeared along the walls as the candles flickered to life. Shadows stretched across the floors and staircases. These early lights signalled the slow approach of evening. Soon the evening meal would bring many people back to the great hall once again. The fires would burn brighter. Voices and laughter would fill the room. Stories might be shared beside the warm hearth. Music might echo beneath the wooden beams of the high ceiling. But for now, the castle rested quietly in the final calm hours of the winter afternoon. Beyond the thick stone walls, cold winds continued to sweep across the frozen land. Yet inside the fortress, careful preparation, warm fires, and the steady work of many hands kept the harsh season at bay just a little longer. As the last pale light of the winter afternoon slowly faded from the sky, the castle began preparing for evening. The short winter day was already coming to an end. Outside the walls, long shadows stretched across the snow-covered ground. The sun slipped lower behind the distant hills, leaving the sky painted in soft shades of grey and pale orange. Cold air quietly settled over the countryside once again. Inside the castle, servants moved quickly through the corridors, lighting candles and oil lamps. Small flames appeared one by one along the stone walls. Their warm glow pushed back the growing darkness of the halls. Even with these lights, many parts of the castle remained dim. Medieval buildings were never brightly lit the way modern spaces are today. Candles were valuable and had to be used carefully, but their soft light created a calm atmosphere that suited the quiet winter evening. In the great hall, the large hearth fire had grown stronger as fresh logs were added. Flames climbed high between the thick pieces of wood. The crackling sound echoed gently beneath the tall wooden roof beams. The firelight danced across the stone walls and colourful tapestries that hung along the sides of the hall. These tapestries now helped trap warmth inside the room as the cold night began returning outside. Slowly, members of the castle household began gathering in the hall once more. The evening meal was one of the most important moments of the day. It brought everyone together after hours of work and activity. Long wooden tables were prepared with bowls, cups, and fresh bread. Servants carried large pots from the kitchens, their surfaces still steaming from the heat of the hearth. The smell of cooked vegetables and rich stew spread throughout the room. After a long winter day, the warmth of the fire and the promise of a hot meal felt especially comforting. People removed their heavy cloaks as they settled onto the benches near the tables. Even though the hall still held a slight chill in the far corners, the area near the hearth felt pleasantly warm. The first bowls of stew were served carefully along the tables. Thick slices of bread were placed beside them. Some guests dipped the bread directly into the stew to soak up the warm broth. Food during winter often focused on simple, filling ingredients. Grains, root vegetables, preserved meats, and dried herbs provided the nourishment needed to survive the cold season. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare during these months, making the stored harvest from autumn extremely valuable. As the meal continued, conversation slowly filled the hall. Voices echoed softly between the stone walls. People spoke about daily tasks, news from nearby villages, and plans for the coming weeks. In many ways, winter created more time for conversation and storytelling. Travel was difficult. Outdoor work was limited, and evenings arrived early. This encouraged people to spend more time together indoors. Near the hearth, a travelling minstrel sat quietly tuning a small lute. Musicians were often welcomed guests in castles. Their songs and stories helped brighten the long winter nights. Once the meal had settled into a relaxed pace, the minstrel began playing a slow melody. The gentle music floated through the hall, blending with the crackle of the fire. Some listeners closed their eyes for a moment, enjoying the peaceful sound. Others continued their quiet conversations while the music played in the background. Music had a calming effect during these cold evenings. It reminded people that life continued even during the harshest seasons. Not far from the main tables, several servants continued working quietly. They refilled cups, cleared empty bowls, and added more wood to the fire when needed. Their work helped maintain the warm and welcoming atmosphere of the hall. Beyond the doors of the great hall, the rest of the castle slowly grew quieter. The kitchens, which had been so busy throughout the day, now settled into a slower pace as the evening meal was served. Cooks cleaned their tools and prepared smaller fires for later use. In the stable yard, lantern light flickered softly as the last evening checks were completed. Stable workers made sure the horses had fresh water and enough hay to last through the night. The animals shifted quietly in their stalls, their breath rising gently into the cool air. Inside the castle towers, some residents had already returned to their chambers. They warmed their hands beside small fireplaces while preparing for the night ahead. Heavy blankets were laid across beds. Candles burned softly beside wooden tables. Winter nights inside a castle could feel long and silent once darkness fully settled. But the thick walls offered protection from the freezing winds outside, and the fires, though small in some rooms, provided just enough warmth to make sleep possible. Back in the great hall, the evening continued with quiet comfort. The minstrel's music shifted into another gentle tune. A few listeners tapped their fingers softly against the wooden table in rhythm with the melody. The fire crackled brightly, sending sparks briefly upward into the dark chimney above. The hall felt alive with warmth and quiet companionship. Moments like these helped people forget the bitter cold waiting outside the castle walls. Beyond the fortress, the winter night had now fully arrived. The sky above the snowy countryside had turned deep blue and black. Stars slowly appeared between drifting clouds. Cold winds swept across the frozen fields and forests surrounding the castle. Yet within the stone walls the fire still burned steadily. The glow of candlelight and hearthlight filled the great hall with gentle warmth. And as the long winter evening continued, the castle remained a small island of light and life in the middle of the cold medieval night. As the evening continued inside the castle, the great hall slowly grew quieter and calmer. Most people had finished their meals, and the long wooden tables were gradually being cleared by servants moving softly through the room. The large hearth still burned brightly, its warm glow spreading across the stone floor and wooden beams above. Every now and then a log shifted in the fire, sending a small shower of sparks upward toward the chimney opening. The sound was gentle and comforting. For many people living in the castle, these quiet winter evenings beside the fire were among the most peaceful moments of the entire day. Outside the thick walls, the cold night had now fully settled across the land. The snow-covered countryside reflected faint starlight under the dark sky. Winds moved softly through the distant forests, carrying the deep chill of winter with them. But inside the castle, life continued in a calm and steady way. Near the hearth, a few members of the household remained seated on the long benches. Some spoke quietly with one another, while others simply rested and enjoyed the warmth of the fire. The travelling minstrel who had played earlier now sat with his instrument resting beside him. He occasionally plucked a few soft notes, letting the music drift gently through the hall. In a nearby corner, two elderly members of the household shared old stories about winters long ago. They spoke about years when the snow had been so deep that roads disappeared entirely. Caravans and travellers had been forced to remain inside castle walls for weeks at a time. During those winters, the great hall had become even more important. It was the place where people gathered to stay warm, share news, and pass the long dark evenings together. Storytelling had always been an important tradition during medieval winters. Before books were common, and before most people could read, stories carried knowledge from one generation to another. Tales of brave knights, distant lands, strange creatures, and great adventures travelled across Europe through spoken words alone, and winter nights beside the fire were the perfect time for such stories to be shared. Meanwhile, servants continued their evening tasks quietly around the hall. Some collected empty bowls and cups, stacking them carefully on wooden trays. Others swept the floor where crumbs and small bits of rushes had gathered during the meal. Even late in the evening, the castle required constant work to keep everything running smoothly. In the kitchens, a smaller fire still burned beneath one of the large hearths. The cooks were preparing simple late-night food for guards and workers who remained on duty through the night. Not everyone in the castle could sleep when darkness arrived. Guards, stable workers, and a few servants always stayed awake to keep watch and maintain important tasks. A pot of thick soup simmered slowly near the fire. Its warm steam filled the kitchen air with a comforting smell. One cook stirred the pot slowly while speaking quietly with a young kitchen helper. The glow from the hearth lit the stone walls with soft orange light. Compared to the silent corridors outside, the kitchen still felt alive with warmth and gentle activity. In the castle courtyard, several torches had been lit along the inner walls. Their flames flickered and bent slightly in the cold night wind. The courtyard itself was quiet now, covered in smooth, untouched snow. Boot prints from earlier in the evening had already begun to fade under the falling frost. Two guards slowly walked along the inner path of the wall, their cloaks pulled tightly around their shoulders. They carried lanterns that cast small circles of light onto the snowy ground. Night watch inside a castle was always important, especially during winter when darkness lasted many hours. Even peaceful regions required careful attention. Travellers might arrive late seeking shelter from the cold, or unexpected visitors might approach the gates. Inside the stables, the horses rested calmly in their stalls. The warm scent of hay filled the air. Their slow breathing created gentle clouds of mist in the dim lantern light. Stable workers checked the animals one final time before settling into their own small resting spaces nearby. The stables remained one of the warmest buildings during winter nights because of the animals' body heat. Many stable hands preferred sleeping there rather than in colder servant quarters. Back inside the castle towers, residents had begun preparing for sleep. Candles burned softly in small chambers, while people changed into warm sleeping clothes. Beds were covered with thick wool blankets and fur layers to hold as much warmth as possible through the long night. Fireplaces in these rooms were carefully reduced to smaller, steady flames. Large fires might burn too quickly during the night, leaving nothing but cold ashes by morning. Instead, smaller logs were arranged to burn slowly for many hours. In one quiet chamber near the top of a tower, a nobleman sat beside his fireplace reading by candlelight. The flickering flame cast moving shadows across the parchment pages. Outside his narrow window, the stars shone brightly over the frozen countryside. He pulled his wool cloak tighter as the cool air drifted through the stone room. Even with the fire burning nearby, the chill of the walls could still be felt. Yet moments like this were strangely peaceful. The silence of winter nights often created a sense of calm within the castle walls. Back in the great hall, the final candles were being trimmed and replaced for the night. Only a few people remained near the fire now. The minstrel quietly packed away his instrument. The elderly storytellers had finished their tales and slowly made their way toward their chambers. Servants added one last heavy log to the great hearth before stepping away. The fire would burn slowly through the night, leaving enough embers to easily restart the flames in the morning. Gradually the hall returned to silence. The massive room that had been filled with voices and laughter earlier now rested under the quiet glow of the firelight. Outside, the cold winter wind moved softly around the tall stone towers of the castle. But inside the walls, the warmth of the hearth and the shelter of thick stone kept the night peaceful and still as the long medieval winter continued. As the night deepened, the castle slowly settled into silence. Most of the household had now retreated to their chambers, leaving the long corridors dimly lit by a few carefully placed candles. The great hall, which had been filled with voices and warmth earlier in the evening, now rested quietly beneath the glow of the great hearth fire. The flames had lowered slightly, burning more slowly as the large log placed there earlier continued to smoulder. Soft orange light flickered across the stone walls and wooden beams above. Occasionally a small crack echoed from the fire as the wood shifted and settled deeper into the embers. For those still awake, the castle felt very different at night. During the day it was filled with movement and activity, but during the deep hours of winter darkness, the halls felt calm, almost peaceful. The thick stone walls seemed to hold the quiet inside them. In one of the long corridors leading away from the great hall, a servant carefully carried a lantern while making a final check of the evening fires. This was an important task before everyone slept. If a fire burned too strongly during the night, it could become dangerous. But if it burned too weakly, the room might grow bitterly cold before morning. The servant paused beside a smaller fireplace and gently adjusted the logs so they would burn slowly and safely. The lantern light swayed slightly as he moved down the corridor. His footsteps echoed softly across the stone floor before fading again into silence. High above the courtyard, guards continued their night watch along the castle walls. The winter air was sharp and cold at that height. Wind swept across the towers and battlements, tugging at the edges of their heavy cloaks. Even through thick wool and leather, the cold could still be felt. But the guards were used to these long hours. They walked slowly along the walls, their lanterns casting faint circles of light along the snowy stones. From their position they could see far across the sleeping countryside. The frozen fields stretched quietly beneath the moonlight. Occasionally the distant howl of a wolf drifted through the night air from the forest far beyond the hills. The guards listened carefully but remained calm. Wild animals were common sounds during winter nights. Inside the castle courtyard everything was still. The torches along the inner walls burned quietly, their flames bending gently in the cold wind. Snow on the ground reflected the faint orange glow of the firelight. Footprints left earlier in the evening had frozen into the surface of the snow. The large wooden gate at the entrance of the castle remained firmly closed. Heavy iron bars secured it from the inside. If a traveller arrived during the night seeking shelter, they would have to call loudly for the guards above. Travelling after dark during winter was rare and often dangerous. Most people wisely waited for daylight before continuing their journeys. Inside the stables, the horses rested quietly in their stalls. Their slow breathing filled the dim space with gentle sound. A single lantern hung from a wooden beam, providing just enough light for the stable worker resting nearby. He had wrapped himself in a thick wool blanket while sitting on a pile of straw. The warmth from the animals helped keep the stable far more comfortable than many other parts of the castle during winter nights. Occasionally a horse shifted its hooves or shook its mane softly before settling again. These small movements were the only sounds in the otherwise quiet building. Elsewhere inside the castle, most rooms were now dark except for the soft glow of dying fires. In the private chambers of the nobles, thick curtains had been drawn across the narrow windows. These curtains helped block the cold draughts that sometimes slipped through the stone frames. Beds were layered with wool blankets, heavy quilts, and fur coverings to hold as much warmth as possible. People sleeping inside the castle often wore simple night garments, along with wool caps to keep their heads warm. Even indoors, winter nights could feel quite cold once the fires burned lower. In one tower chamber, a young page stirred slightly in his sleep as a cold breeze brushed across the room. The small fireplace nearby still held glowing embers, but the flames had faded to a gentle red glow. He pulled the blanket higher around his shoulders before drifting back into sleep. Down in the great hall, the large hearth continued to burn slowly. The final log placed there earlier had now turned mostly to glowing coals. Their deep red light pulsed softly in the darkness. The hall felt enormous and quiet without the voices that had filled it during the evening meal. Long tables stood empty beneath the shadows of the high-ceiling beams. Tapestries hanging on the walls moved slightly whenever a faint draught slipped through the room. Yet even in the silence, the warmth from the hearth still lingered. It was enough to keep the room from freezing during the long night hours. This slow-burning fire would also make the morning easier when servants returned to rebuild the flames at dawn. Outside the castle, the winter night stretched on beneath a sky filled with stars. The moon cast pale light across the frozen countryside. Fields, forests, and distant villages rested quietly under the blanket of cold. Within the strong stone walls of the castle, people slept peacefully, protected from the harsh wind and frost outside. The fires that remained burning through the night served as small guardians of warmth against the cold season. And as the hours slowly passed, the castle continued resting in calm silence, waiting for the first light of morning to return once again. As the deepest hours of the winter night slowly passed, the castle rested in complete stillness. Most fires had burned low, leaving only soft glowing embers in the hearths. These faint red lights flickered quietly in the darkness of the great stone rooms. Outside, the cold had grown even sharper as the night reached its quietest moment. A thin layer of frost covered the snow in the courtyard, sparkling faintly beneath the pale moonlight. High above the castle walls, the guards continued their slow patrols along the battlements. Their lanterns moved like small drifting stars against the dark outline of the towers. The cold air stung their faces, and their breath appeared in steady clouds as they walked. But the night was peaceful. No travellers approached the gate. No sounds came from the distant countryside except the soft whisper of winter wind moving across the frozen land. Inside the castle, silence filled the long corridors and stairways. Only the occasional crackle from a dying fire or the faint creak of old wooden beams disturbed the stillness. In the stables, the horses remained calm and warm beneath thick layers of straw. Their slow breathing and quiet movements created a gentle rhythm in the dim building. The stable worker resting nearby stirred slightly but remained wrapped in his wool blanket, still half asleep beside the lantern's fading glow. Throughout the castle towers, most residents slept deeply beneath heavy blankets and fur coverings. The cold of the night pressed against the outer stone walls, but inside the chambers the warmth trapped by thick bedding helped keep the chill away. Curtains remained drawn across narrow windows to block draughts. Small fireplaces continued to glow softly, their embers holding just enough heat to last until morning. In one quiet chamber near the top of the castle, a single candle had nearly burned down to its base. Its small flame flickered weakly, casting long shadows along the stone walls before finally fading into darkness. The room returned to silence as the sleeping resident remained undisturbed beneath a pile of wool blankets. Back in the great hall, the large hearth now held only glowing coals. The massive room felt darker and cooler than it had during the lively evening meal. Yet the warmth from the fire still lingered gently across the stone floor. The long wooden tables stood empty, their surfaces reflecting faint red light from the embers. Tapestries hanging along the walls moved slightly whenever a faint draught passed through the hall. These heavy fabrics continued their quiet work of keeping some warmth inside the vast chamber. Hours passed slowly in this peaceful silence. Beyond the castle walls, the winter sky slowly began to change. Far on the horizon, the faintest trace of pale grey appeared as the night prepared to give way to morning. The stars above the countryside gradually faded as the first hint of dawn approached. Inside the castle courtyard, frost covered the stones and frozen footprints from the previous evening. The torches along the walls had burned low, their flames now little more than glowing tips of charcoal. The guards on the night watch noticed the slow brightening of the sky. They had walked the walls for many hours, but now their long shift was nearly finished. One guard paused briefly near the edge of the battlement, looking out across the quiet winter landscape. The distant forests and fields were still wrapped in pale darkness, but the promise of daylight had begun to return. Inside the castle, the first signs of morning slowly appeared. In the kitchens, a servant stirred beside the hearth and began preparing the fire once more. He carefully placed fresh pieces of wood over the glowing embers left from the night before. Soon the fire began to grow again, small flames rising slowly between the logs. The warmth of a new day was beginning. Not long after, another servant entered the kitchen, carrying a bucket of water from the well. Their quiet conversation echoed softly through the stone room as the castle slowly began waking from its long winter night. In the stables, the horses shifted as they sensed movement nearby. The stable worker rose from his resting place and stretched before beginning the morning tasks of feeding and watering the animals. Lantern light once again brightened the building as the day's work quietly resumed. Far above in the castle chambers, some residents began stirring beneath their blankets. The faint glow of early morning filtered through the edges of their curtains. Another cold winter day had arrived, yet the castle had endured the long freezing night just as it had done for countless winters before. Its thick stone walls, warm hearths, heavy blankets, and the careful work of many people had protected those inside from the harsh cold beyond. This was the quiet rhythm of medieval winter life. Each day began with cold stone halls and fading embers. Then fires were lit, meals were prepared, work resumed, and the castle slowly filled with warmth and activity once again. And when night returned, the same careful routine would protect everyone through the darkness until morning arrived again. So while medieval castles were often cold, uncomfortable, and far from perfect homes during winter, they were also places of shelter, community, and endurance. Behind their towering walls, people worked together to survive the long frozen season year after year. Fires were tended, stories were shared, meals were cooked, and life continued quietly within the stone fortress as winter slowly moved towards spring. The castle stood strong against the cold winds of the medieval world, just as it always had.